Welcome back to A Fork in Time. Today will be one of the shorter episodes that you'll normally hear from us because we're trying to keep these good and tight. But we talked about this during our live stream at 200. That's the idea that we would come back on a regular, consistent basis because we've set up this mechanism, our Discord server, and the other things that we have on the website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com, where we get feedback from listeners. And we wanted to incorporate the feedback into what we had done, sort of continuing this loop along. So if our listeners take the time to give us some feedback, we wanted to actually come back in and talk about that feedback and come back around to it. So this one's going to focus on episodes 207 through 213. And in the middle of that was actually our last feedback episode. So we're skipping over that. But we're going back here, and I'm joined today by Chris, Dylan, and Robert. Chris is going to say hi to the good people.
Hi, good people.
Yeah, all right. Now we're officially into this. We're going to retire that, by the way, at some point.
No, we're not.
Yeah. I know I'll get like a letter from Chris's lawyer, and Dylan will have to defend the podcast. I know what's going to happen there. But we'll get it. Ooh.
Never put a real estate lawyer in the courtroom. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you all that right now.
I feel like I'm going to become a podcast sovereign citizen.
There you go.
Podcast something like this.
That would be the one time I would show up in court, though, is if I could do that. And then I'll have all kinds of fun.
Yeah. So I don't think we had a lot of listener feedback, interestingly enough, on episode 207, which is Caboose Compromise. There we talked about a different scenario for the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad, which I really enjoyed us putting that episode together. That one just sort of, our listeners, I think, listened to it, but they didn't have much to say. Did you guys have any additional thoughts, maybe anything we didn't cover there, just to throw in as an afterthought on that one?
No, I really didn't. I mean, obviously it was my idea, so of course I don't have anything additional to say. But I think there was a little bit of discussion that we got in the forums, maybe about the economic side of things. But I don't, it's one of those topics that's so closely related, and it doesn't have enough time to really kind of dovetail and spin off into anything too crazy in terms of a divergence. Yeah, I think to be perfectly honest, I think it was kind of a stretch to even get there, but it was fun to talk about.
Yeah, we came back, and we can reference trains again here. Not one we're going to talk about today, but we talk about the episode where we talk about Maryland going to the Confederacy. We talked about the role that rails played in that. So railroads were an important part of this era in all kinds of ways, militarily, but also in the manifest destiny growth of the country. So that was there. So Chris, you captained an episode with one of our with Marcos, one of our listeners, about the some alternatives to the Russian Revolution, as I recall there. Mm-hmm. So I'm looking here through what was there. Not a lot of comment from our listeners there, so you guys must have covered it all, and it must have all been good. Anything you have as a follow-up thought from that?
Evan, look down. Evan had some comments on it.
Okay.
I don't want to get
there it is. Yeah, there it is.
Lawyery and technical, but I don't know if he counts as a just a pure listener anymore. We are recording this after he's already been on a show.
As a guest.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm looking at his comments now. So he came up there with the idea that one of his things was, if I'm just going to read it here, just from my limited understanding of the time period, if there were no Soviets, the peasantry, in my view, is ticked off enough to where that any hint of a restoration of what they were fighting against, this being the czars and the monarchy, would have been a no-go. And so I can easily see a period where no Soviets, a sort of French Revolution style period where there's a weak Republican government overseeing a reign of terror. So basically he's outlining here a Russian equivalent of the reign of terror. Is that a fair way probably to describe what he's suggesting there?
I think.
Any thoughts on that, Chris, especially since you led the episode?
So I get what my first thought is this. There was a party specifically focused on the peasantry. They were the social revolutionaries. And in the closest thing to elections that happened, the elections to the Constituent Assembly, they massively outnumbered the Bolsheviks. So I think at this point, I understand the point that that the peasantry, was very important, wouldn't have supported any kind of monarchical restoration. I don't think you necessarily see a reign of terror type of thing. I think you could actually see a republic and a somewhat popularly based republic coming out of this. I think, timing this with what's going on in World War One, I think the defeat of the Bolsheviks takes until basically the end of 1918. So what you have in France in kind of a 1793 period is like all of the European powers decide to invade them all at once. You don't have that here. You don't have the interventions we saw against the Bolsheviks because people don't necessarily see the SRs as threatening the status quo as much. And so you don't have this sense that our nation is under threat. And I think the idea of the nation being under threat just ramps up the violence, ramps up the justifications for the terror in France in 1793. And without that in SR Russia, whatever that turns into, a peasant focused Russia, I don't think you have the violence level that you do in first almost a terror that's created by the Bolsheviks because you don't have those foreign interventions and you don't have the kind of terror that happened in France.
Yeah, and Marcos actually responded later in the Discord about this idea of it. It morphs, to any sense that it's restorative. It morphs into more of a constitutional monarchy, kind of scenario. So it's obviously not going back to an absolute czarish style of rule. It's something that is recognizing this place of them coming out of a monarchical system, but also recognizing more of a democratic thrust here because of what's caused the revolution to begin with, right at the end of the day. So I think that's kind of interesting. I didn't have tons of additional thoughts about that. I also, that's one of the, an area of history that I know about, but that's one of the places you get down to the weeds there. There's a lot of weeds to get down into. It's just, it's one of those areas I think that's more a specialized area of history. So it's one of those things, the smartest thing for Don to do is to talk less about it because he knows about it generally, but doesn't know about it specifically enough to probably say anything that's intelligent that's not going to would survive scrutiny. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you, Don. I know just enough about this to be dangerous in all of the bad ways. Once, I remember listening to the episode, and especially once you started talking about white generals, the ones I didn't recognize from Hearts of Iron 4 mods, I was like, this all sounds like a soup or something.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, I got nothing. I didn't
mention Savinko. I totally want to go back and mention Savinko.
There's a bunch of Hearts of Iron 4 mods. Yeah. You can't be expected to remember all of them. My only quick thought was, I guess, if you did have something like that, I'd be curious long-term, the stability of it, just because at that point, the Russians have been burned twice that I can think of by Romanovs who claim to be trying to liberalize the country. So I would hesitate to think that a constitutional monarchy or a parliamentary monarchy would do any better than a sort of Weimar Germany in the long term, but I don't know where that would dovetail. Like I don't think you would get Russian fascists instead of Nazis or anything, but I think structurally the timetable for when a constitutional monarchy would collapse would be within 2-3 decades, just based on the economic development of Russia. But that's just my top level. I don't have any real details to support that.
And my only thought is jumping off of that is if it collapses around that same time frame, then you're looking at it and the collapse of the Weimar Republic at about the same time. So what impacts does that have on World War II? Because Hitler no longer has the Russian alliance to rely on to invade Poland. So does he start it differently? And then at the same time, does he fork out and start heading into Russia sooner as a part of that?
Or not to take this to a really, really dark place, but I think that's kind of what I specialize in.
I think I know where you're going. I think I like this, so go.
One of the things that Stalin, legitimately did was industrialize a decent amount of the Soviet economy. And if he doesn't, and Germany plays out the way it did, whatever white government comes out of this, whatever government comes out of this, be it a moderate constitutional monarchy, be it a Kerensky-led parliament yeah, I'm going full Kaiserreich.
I was going to say an Unger
Yep.
Sternburn Mongolian horde.
Yeah. If you don't have that impetus, just single-minded push to develop heavy industry, the Eastern Front of World War II was such a near-run thing that any of these things changes, and it is very believable that it goes another way. So regardless of what might have possibly led to the collapse there, man, I think a Barbarossa easily leads to a collapse there. Or you could be looking at a Russia in a position where they don't have the industrial capacity to fend off the Germans the way they did in our timeline, with a lot of help.
Well, it ties back to me. My understanding of what gets to the point of the Russian Revolution is just how backward economically and how non-industrialized and non-developed. I mean, the reason you still have serfs is you're still functioning under an economic model that is literally centuries and centuries old.
And just to put this out there, in this scenario in which we're laying out, where we do have a Kornilov uniting the white generals and taking back over, the power in White Russia at this point is the very, very narrow sliver of the society that has a vested interest in keeping those things the way they are.
Yep. So even more of an argument for why you don't have change.
Right.
Because change is change. And change, as you said, those that have the ability the few that have the ability to prevent it under this scenario are engaged in preventing it.
Well, and I think you also have in something like where there's no Soviets in Russia, I think that so drastically alters the landscape of World War II, because so much of, German and to a lesser extent Italian irredentism was expressly anti-Soviet or anti-Bolshevik. Without that sort of counterpoint, something happens that makes Germany and Italy very strange places to be in the 1930s and 40s, but I don't, the chessboard's not positioned in a way that Germany, I think, becomes the impetus for all of it.
I think it still does, because I think, first and foremost, even without the Soviets, you still have Schneiderman and the other SPD members being blamed by the Nazis for signing Versailles.
Stab in the back. Stab in the back still happened.
Yeah. And the other part of it is this. If you look at German irredentism, it is ethnic and it is based upon blood. It has nothing to do with politics, to a large extent.
Yeah, and I guess that's more what I'm going for. It becomes much more of an overtly ethnic thing. The sort of social Darwinist period of Western history, I think, would be extended, because you don't have the sort of Bolshevik Soviet communism sort of filter on the top. Everybody's just much more blatant about, oh yeah, we just don't like Slavs, or we don't, like people of this religion, or whatever. I think it just becomes much more straightforwardly that. And I think that's what makes the board more interesting.
Ethnic becomes the target more than
Because
philosophic
then,
becomes the target.
Because then you start, when you start comparing that with somebody like a Winston Churchill in Britain, that becomes much more interesting depending on who's at play, where he's going to land on which side of what conflict. Or even like your Teddy Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge types that may still be around, kind of in the wings. I think it creates a much messier powder keg. The question is just, we don't have the ideological sort of, dialectic that surrounds it, to
Yeah.
borrow a ideological dialectic word.
So I thought it was a good episode, and again, I think it's an interesting thing to think further about, because it's that, one of the fascinating things that I've come to understand better just as a result of the podcast is which I knew before, but it's you've heard me talk about it so many times, the interplay between World War I, World War II, the interwar years, the things that lead up to we have a tendency to want to compartmentalize these things in ways that they just don't really compartmentalize. It all connects together, and there's changing this variable into that constant changes the entire equation, maybe not in the biggest picture overall, but it certainly changes individual things that are there. One of my favorite quotes, now we're going to jump to actually a little bit further down to Rock the Boat, episode 210, which was a great episode. We killed off a lot of generals, killed off a lot of land generals while they were on water. That's the interesting thing about that episode. But I love the quote here from one of our listeners. We refer to her often, which is Helena Nash. This is what she writes. There's something especially quote unquote forky about ships in wartime. It's an environment where you can lose a whole crew in a single blow and divert the timeline before some of those seamen, midshipmen, and junior officers get to make their mark on history. And then she goes on to actually reference the HMS Hood being sunk by the Bismarck in 41. Only three crewmen survived, but one of them happens to be someone who eventually goes on to play the third Doctor in Doctor Who. She always brings it back in good ways to that. But I love that line that there's something about ships that are especially forky. And what was fascinating to me about this episode was that it was the boat, but it's a lot of land generals for the most part that are on this boat just because it's a siege, and this is how they're doing the scouting of the siege of Veracruz. And so I think we only scratched the surface at that episode of all that goes, because of who was literally on that boat. And none of them, by the way, go on to play Doctor Who, just to keep it in proper perspective there. But any more thoughts about Rock the Boat? I thought that was one of the best episodes we've done in quite a while, actually.
Yeah, I just really love that topic. So this is not additional thoughts, so I'm going to keep this quick, but just to give you an idea of how long I have had that in the bag. There's a book that I have. It's called Lions of the West. It's like 4 or 5 mini biographies of famous people throughout the settling of the American West. And there is like 2 lines in the chapter about Winfield Scott that talks about that. And I was like, that would be so crazy if that boat just blew up, because it completely upends the board. I think I've had that in the back of my head for probably 10 years.
Yeah, and I think we will. We talk all the time. We talk about coming back to these things. We will come back to some variant off of that, because we only, we touched basically just the Mexican-American War aspect of that, and I don't think we even did that as much justice as it actually deserves. But that doesn't get further down into the these same cast of characters as they play into the Civil War. We touched on that briefly, but didn't even get there. Yeah. I don't have much else to say on that. Either Dylan, you chimed in there. Robert, you have anything else on that one?
No, that was a fun episode, and like you said, Helena, I think you nailed it. It's boats are forky, especially, and if you think about it, I know they were all junior officers at the time, but I guess my thought after we finished that is, it goes back to the State of the Union. There's always the designated survivor, who thought it was a good idea to put all the people on the boat at the same time on one level.
Well, nobody that thought the boat was in danger, that's for sure.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm gonna focus this on one more, because we intentionally said we wanted to keep this one short, and this will let us go down there. I'm gonna skip over What If Willies, because I know our listeners not all about our baseball episodes, but I really enjoyed doing that. I always love doing those episodes with Ryan Cole. The other thing I remember about all those episodes is, it's a lot of what Ken Burns focused on in his baseball. You can tell a lot about the history of race relations in America by looking at our national pastime as a game. You learn a lot from that, and we focused a little bit that on Willie there. But the big thing that we did, which we took a 2-part actually a 3-part over 2 parts kind of approach there to it. Was this idea of the 1996 assassination that could have occurred of Clinton, and the stepping in of Al Gore, and that certainly got some feedback from our listeners there. And to me, Evan, we mentioned him earlier here. He talks a little bit more about, how things might have, other characters, Rick Santorum, Mike Huckabee. We started going down all these various paths because of changing the timeline of a 9/11-esque thing in a different way here. But then we got to that fun thing that we've spent a lot of time actually on recent episodes with, which if you start moving around who's elected or running when, it's hard to figure out how that ripples out, just because they're the same people going to come along in the next little bit. Any follow-up thoughts on that? Again, there's a lot of good comment there on our Discord. We can't even do it justice here, but any follow-up thoughts that have occurred since we did that, since we created the 1996 Clinton change arc?
I thoroughly enjoyed listening, especially to the second part, not involved in it, of the political discussion, because y'all always pick people and I'm like, I never would have picked them in a million years. And I think of other people and I'm like, what? How did y'all? I actually, I think I posted this in the Discord, but my one thing was, I think as much as we talked about, Al Gore being this kind of avenging angel, like, getting Bill Clinton back, and as much as I think we kind of shoved Hillary to the side, I hate to say it, I actually think she would have been able to get one term. I don't think they would have been able to do much more than that. And the only reason I say this is because I think the idea of like a mirror imaged 08 response is just too interesting to throw away.
Okay. We certainly spent some time talking about her, I think, in some of the off podcast prep, and then I know we mentioned her as we were looking at the various candidates that were there. It's just, to me, the biggest thing about that, and again, not to just rehash the episode because there's the danger of doing that, is changing to a 9. Again, I think we can intellectually grasp the assassination of an American president on foreign soil intellectually, but I don't think we can fully tap our understanding, and that's why we kept making the 9/11 allusions here about what the emotions of that would be. I don't think we can fully. We say that we can, but I don't think, not having lived through it, I don't think we realize probably how that really would have gone down and what that would have done, I guess is my point. I think we actually didn't. We undersold that to some degree. If it's possible to undersell that. That's the thing I kept coming back to when I re-listened to the episode and think about it is, we talked a lot about that, but there's more to that.
Well, and I think it's so easy in a situation like that. It's so easy to talk about the domestic side of things because that's the part that we can all talk about regardless of what changes there. But the complete different, I mean, like you could almost start measuring time differently pre and post 9/11. Like it's almost a BC AD level thing. So to try and talk about it, I really don't know how we would have done it, really.
Yeah. And then the other thing that came to me there was, we would have, we talked about this a little on the episode, but we steered away from it to some degree because the first episode was far more fascinating just in how in the world do you deal with this quasi place that you're stuck in. Dylan, you helped guide us through that, where, the Constitution sort of covers this, but it sort of doesn't kind of thing. How do we navigate through that? Okay, we probably would have navigated it through, okay, if for no other reason than Bob Dole is there on the other side who's not going to do something, just absolutely nuts because he's Bob Dole, right? But the thing I think we also skipped over there was we missed a lot of the scandal part of the Clinton presidency, and we didn't spend as much time talking about that. We talked about it some, but again, we talked a lot more about what would have been because of Gore. In fact, the episodes are entitled Gore Steps In. It was a lot more about what it would mean to have Gore as president versus what it meant to not have Clinton, what we got from Clinton, to miss the vast majority of the impeachment, to miss the biggest part of what we know is the Lewinsky scandal, and all of those things that played out the way they played out. Not having those, I think, especially having just recently done the Watergate episode, it's the reminder that was sort of the next generation of sort of let's erode the trust that Americans have in their leadership, government, for whether you're for or against him. Doesn't matter. It's another thing that changes how you think about your leaders. And actually, I didn't think I would see an impeachment during my lifetime.
Mm-hmm.
Saw one. Saw how the mechanism works all the way through. Actually, how it works. The actual trial and the whole bit. Saw all the way through.
That's one of my favorite things about whenever we get to talk about any part of just how the Constitution or the government works is like it's so easy to read it on paper, and then no matter what it is, it can be the most minor irrelevant thing. You're like, oh my God, this is so weird in real life. It's almost like it was a procedure that was written 200 years ago that we just don't use very much.
Right.
It's like no matter what you're watching, it's like a blast from the past.
I agree with that. And so any other thoughts about the feedback that we got? A lot of the feedback there, again, if our listeners really want to know, the links will be in there to those particular Discord areas. So I'll point you to where they are in front of the show notes here. But there's good stuff there. We just wanted to have this as a way to respond back to some of the things. And also a good example here, Dylan wasn't on one of the episodes, so he missed the chance to chime in. So this is a chance for him to he gets to give feedback to the feedback because he wasn't there to provide the thing that we're giving the feedback to. So that's also one of the benefits that comes from that. But we were talking, I think it comes up in the episode that'll be released this week, which is the one that we did with Evan. The Clinton assassination becomes one of our things we keep going to come back to because it's one of these sort of alternative. It's like it's like one of our versions of the Kelvin timeline. Once you change this, you sort of changed everything, from that point on or moving forward. All right, we are. We're going to wrap this down here for the feedback episode. So again, I thank Chris and Dylan and Robert for joining me for that. We want I'll make the pitch again. We want the feedback. We enjoy the feedback. We enjoy engaging there. A lot of the reason we don't have as much to say here is we've already engaged back in the Discord feedback. So if you gave the feedback there, we responded back there and gave some comment on it. And so if you're not part of that, it may not be something that you do. That's more of a gamer place in a lot of ways. And by the way, it's gotten bad pub in the media here because of it's the place that secrets get sold and other stuff like that has happened too. Discord is not a bad thing. It's just it's a platform, but it's a great platform for being able to chat about things with our listeners there. So we encourage you to join that. So this is Don signing off for this episode of A Fork in Time. Once again, thanking our listeners for your patronage and asking you to join us next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.